Hi everyone, we're Team 2, and today we'll be talking about ranching and grazing policy in Arizona. My name is Kylie Flynn.
I'm Marshall Morgan.
I'm Akila David.
I'm Ashley Lucas.
I'm Eliana Burns.
Okay, we're going to jump right in and start with stating our problem statement. In Arizona, land managers and federal land management agencies, such as the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, have historically prioritized ranchers as the leading stakeholder group when making management decisions due to their economic influence. This often leaves other stakeholder groups, such as private landowners and environmentalists, feeling as if their preferences are being ignored despite having valid concerns. Going into a little bit of the background, the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management established grazing lease and permit systems in the early 1900s. And then starting off with a quote from legal scholar Charles Wilkinson, he describes range policy in the 20th century as a series of attempts to resuscitate the range from the condition it reached in the late 1800s that proceeded in the face of ranchers who continue to assert their right to graze herds without regulation. A little bit more of the background. Since the 19th century, ranching has been the most land-extensive industry in Arizona. Approximately 86% of Arizona meets the requirements to be classified as rangelands. The state of Arizona holds the responsibility of designating and setting aside land for ranchers through land grazing permits. Public grazing permits and open range policies provide ranchers with an opportunity to mitigate costs and responsibilities associated with cattle ranching. Arizona is what is known as an open range state, which means that the responsibility of the whereabouts of livestock and their impact falls not upon the rancher, who is the official owner of the livestock, but on landowners who own the property that the livestock is found upon. Within Arizona exists no fence districts. These are areas where the responsibility is switched, and it is the livestock owner's responsibility to keep their livestock off of private property. But these areas are very limited within Arizona.
We're going to be talking about the environmental and societal impacts as well as the stakeholders involved. So I'm going to talk about the positives first, because ranchers will argue against environmentalists with these. So examples include nutrient recycling. When cattle defecate, they contribute organic matter to soil, and they also serve as habitats for other species by safeguarding ecosystem services. They also eat dry grass, which could easily catch on fire, so it's beneficial for Arizona's dry and hot climate. Some negatives include soil erosion. When cattle compact soil, especially in wet areas, they destroy native vegetation. And like in all animal agriculture, they create greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And with more cows means more need for water, which in Arizona is already in short supply, especially during droughts. And they do not keep land from being built upon. If pasture lands were privately owned, then ranchers can make sure that land isn't being built on. But with open grazing, people can purchase and build on the land. So moving on to the societal impacts. So ranching is a longstanding tradition present for centuries. Families have braved through droughts, weather, and other hardships in order to farm. So it would be pretty detrimental to the families to have to stop if policy change permits that. It also keeps people employed. For every 100 jobs in the cattle community, there's 65 jobs in outside operations created. There'd be extreme economic impacts because beef is one of Arizona's top agricultural commodities. And there's also air quality impacts, especially for people who live around the cows. They would have an impacted quality of life. So moving on to the stakeholders, I have 6 here. The first is the federal government, which can create and change policies, make direct and indirect subsidies. They need to listen to all the other stakeholders involved. Next is Arizona ranchers. Their livelihoods are directly affected by policy changes. State government, so ranching provides revenue for the state, so they definitely have to listen to the needs of ranchers, but also the needs of landowners. There's also cattle consumers or cattle product consumers who desire quality and reasonable prices, which could change with policy. And there's Arizona residents. They have to deal with free-range cattle and impacted air quality. And the environmentalists are the last stakeholder. They've been involved for a very long time. In the past, they have purposely cut fences and done other forms of sabotage. So they're a very important stakeholder to keep happy in this process. Now we're going to move on to the importance.
Awesome. So I'll be talking about the importance of ranching and grazing. The ranching industry is an important source of beef and other cattle products. The ranching industry is also what supports these ranchers and their families financially, and the conservation of the land is also vital to keep the grazing industry operating. The other species living within this ecosystem also share this land and depend on it for their survival. And then the dilemmas and gaps within existing policy is that there is no aid for landowners to create fencing around their property outside no fencing districts. So if they can't afford to fence their perimeter of the property, they are vulnerable to having their land or property invaded and possibly damaged from livestock. With the Sagebrush Rebellion, legislators in Arizona and other Western states have been pushing to gain control of millions of acres of forests, ranges, and public lands in their state from federal influence, claiming that the federal government has mismanaged the land. And with a lack of proper management, the land is vulnerable to desertification, with soil erosion, the destruction of native vegetation, contamination of waterways, and large consumption of water. The open range space is a situation where environmentalist position is not prioritized in the discussion. Existing policy includes the Homestead Act of 1862, which was created during the Civil War and provided that any adult citizen can claim 160 acres of government land with requirements to cultivate and create a home or some type of development on the land. And they were free to do what they wanted with the land after 5 years. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 regulated the management of public grazing lands to prevent the overgrazing and the soil erosion, to also create improvements that needed development to stabilize the land and the livestock industry. The Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976 states that the federal land should stay under federal ownership and establish the Bureau of Land Management to manage these federal lands. The Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 1978 provides a set of procedures for the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service to monitor and set grazing fees for the rangelands. The Arizona Revised Statutes 3-1420 to 3-1228 or 3-1428 are a series of laws within Arizona that deal with no fence districts and the obligations of landowners.
I will now be speaking about the policy alternatives. So after analyzing current policies, we concluded that the most efficient ways to address the dilemmas and gaps within the existing policies is to propose the following policy alternatives. First, the Title III, Article 8 of the Arizona Constitution. This is the Arizona Revised Statutes 3120 through 3128. They should be amended to include the values and interests of landholders who are directly impacted by the open range ranching policies that are defined. The reason for this is that the current statutes include defining no fence districts, the ways that these fences are lawfully defined, and the overall expectations and responsibilities of the private individuals and the cattle ranchers. This then ties into the second policy alternative, which would be to create financial assistance or grants for landholders in fence districts. As Article 8 puts all fiscal responsibility on landholders, it is therefore crucial to create public grants for the landholders to mitigate the financial burden of construction of fence. The third alternative would be to increase public grazing land leases. Considering in the state of Arizona, it is 4 times cheaper for a rancher to get a public grazing lease than it would be for a private lease. Many ranchers therefore choose to get the public grazing leases, and this therefore puts an increase on the amount of cattle that are actually using the open range practices. If the state were to change and actually increase the lease costs, then they would be able to create a revenue which could be reallocated to state programs and to different public schools. Lastly, we recommend that the state makes the process to become a no-fence district easier, as communities and districts that want to become no-fence districts have to go through a very difficult process to get approved. If communities and districts were to become no-fence districts, then many of the risks and hazards and many of the gaps that we have already covered would be mitigated for these communities. So the next thing would be our first policy recommendation. So in regards to the policy recommendation, we talked about the state government should partner with federal agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management to provide public grants for any Arizona landholder who lives in a fenced district. These grants would then be used by the landholders to construct a fence on their property to mitigate damages related to open range ranching. Currently under the existing state policies such as ARS 31426 and ARS 31427, private landholders that live in the fenced districts are solely responsible for the cost of constructing a fence and for keeping cattle off their property. If a cattle or any other type of livestock was to end up on their property, and if any damage was to occur, the rancher is not responsible at all. It is simply the landholder's fault for not building a proper fence or for not having a fence at all. Additionally, under these statutes, the state legislature defines that any landholder has to abide by these policies. If they choose not to, then they will be subject to fines, and they could actually be sued if they were to harm or kill a rancher's product. So this puts an additional stress and an additional financial burden on private landholders. So by creating new types of grants, then the state of Arizona will be able to provide these stakeholders with the opportunity to create fences to help their property, to help their families, and to overall just kind of help their community.
So additionally, we recommend that the Arizona government increases the cost of leases to match with neighboring states who have similar open range laws. Arizona is currently the lowest cost for leases for the most land. If this was increased to match Nevada's price of $15, Arizona could see a $20 million increase in revenue. However, even matching New Mexico's, the next state with the lowest lease prices, would double the current revenue for grazing in Arizona. This money could be put towards giving grants to private property owners to build fences, building fences to prevent cattle accidents on highways, reseeding overgrazed land, and ensuring grazing lands have sufficient water. This solution would ultimately benefit both the ranchers and the private property owners while helping to maintain the environment. So in conclusion, cattle ranching has been a part of Arizona's history and has had large impacts on the land. Arizona is still open range and requires leasing permits throughout the state. There are various negative and positive impacts. Negative impacts include damage to the land and vegetation, increased water usage, and damage to private property. Positive impacts include upholding community tradition and maintaining and aiding local employment. Policy reform is needed to please all the stakeholders. In order to deal with these impacts, we suggest increasing leasing prices in order to provide funding for fence grants and environmental upkeep. And finally, we have some discussion questions. So what would you suggest as a solution to the conflict between ranchers and other stakeholder groups in Arizona? Which stakeholder should be given priority? What are potential consequences of reforming or neglecting to reform grazing policy in Arizona? And what do you think is the best way for environmentalists to claim their importance in policy disputes such as these? And here are references. Thank you for watching.